students. Welcome to the Checkpoint Online Sessions. I'm Mr. Charles, and this is the second lesson of week 7. Please go to your coursebook, page 120. The number 1 Ladies Detective Agency by Alexander McCall Smith. Let's read together. Ma Ramotswe had a detective agency in Africa at the foot of Gale Hill. There were its assets: a tiny white van, 2 desks, 2 chairs, a telephone, and an old typewriter. Then there was a teapot, in which Ma Ramotswe, the only lady private detective in Botswana, brewed redbush tea. And 3 mugs, one for herself, one for her secretary, and one for the client. What else does a detective agency really need? Detective agencies rely on human intuition and intelligence, both of which Ma Ramotswe had in abundance. No inventory would ever include those, of course. But there was also the view, which again could appear on no inventory. How could any such list describe what one saw when one looked out of or out from Ma Ramotswe's doors? To the front, an acacia tree, the thorn tree which dots the wide edges of the Kalahari, the great white thorns, a warning, the olive grey leaves, by contrast, so delicate. In its branches, in the late afternoon, or in the cool of the early morning, one might see a go-away bird, or hear it, rather. And beyond the acacia, over the dusty road, the roofs of the town, under a cover of trees and a scrub bush. On the horizon, in a blue shimmer of heat, the hills, like improbable, overgrown termite mounds. Everybody called her Ma Ramotswe, although if people had wanted to be formal, they would have addressed her as Me Ma Ramotswe. This is the right thing for a person of stature, but which she had never used of herself. So it was always Ma Ramotswe, rather than Precious Ramotswe, a name which very few people employed. She was a very good detective, a good woman in a good country, one might say. She loved her country, Botswana, which is a place of peace, and she loved Africa for all its trials. I'm not ashamed to be called an African patriot, said Ma Ramotswe. I love the people whom God made, but I especially know how to love the people who live in this place. They are my people, my brothers and sisters. It is my duty to help them to solve the mysteries in their lives. That is what I am called to do. In idle moments, when there were no pressing matters to be dealt with, and when everybody seemed to be sleepy from the heat, she would sit under the acacia tree. It was a dusty place to sit, and the chickens would occasionally come and peck about her feet. But it was a place which seemed to encourage thought. It was here that Ma Ramotswe would contemplate some of the issues which, in everyday life, may seem so easily be pushed to one side. Everything thought Ma Ramotswe had been something before. Here I am, the only lady private detective in the whole of Botswana, sitting in front of my detective agency. But only a few years ago, there was no detective agency. And before that, before there were even any buildings here, there were just the acacia trees, and the river bed in the distance, and the Kalahari over there, so close. In those days, there was no Botswana even, just the Bechuanaland protractor, protectorate. And before that again, there was Khamas country and lions with the dry wind in their manes. But look at it now. A detective agency right here in the Giborn or Gaborn with me, the fat lady detective, sitting outside and thinking these thoughts about how what is one thing today becomes quite another thing tomorrow. Ma Ramotswe set up the number one ladies detective agency with the proceeds of the sale of her father's cattle. He had owned a big herd and had no other children, so every single beast, all 180 of them, including the white Brahmin bulls, whose grandparents he had bred himself, went to her. The cattle were moved from the cattle post back to the Mokudi, where they waited in the dust under the eyes of the chattering herd boys until the livestock agent came. They fetched a good price, as there had been heavy rains that year, and the grass had been lush. Had it been the year before, when most of that southern part of Africa had been racked by drought, it would have been a different matter. People had dithered then, wanting to hold on to their cattle, as without your cattle you were naked. Others, feeling more desperate, sold, because the rains had failed year after year. They had seen the animals become thinner and thinner. Mara Mutsue was pleased that her father's illness had prevented his making any decision, as now the price had gone up, and those who had held on were well rewarded. I want you to have your own business, he said to her on his deathbed. You'll get a good price for the cattle now. Sell them and buy a business. A butchery, maybe. Whatever you like. She held her father's hand and looked into the eyes of the man she loved beyond all others, her daddy, her wise daddy, whose lungs had been filled with dust in those mines, and who had scrimped and saved to make life good for her. It was difficult to talk through her tears, but she managed to say, I'm going to set up a detective agency down in Gaborone. It will be the best one in Botswana, the number one agency. For a moment, her father's eyes opened wide, and it seemed as if he was struggling to speak. But, but, but he died before he could say anything more. And Mara Mutswe fell on his chest and wept for all the dignity, love, and suffering that died with him. She had a sign painted in print or in bright colors, which was then set up just off the Lobast Road on the edge of town, pointing to the small building she had purchased. The number one ladies detective agency for all confidential matters and inquiries, satisfaction guaranteed for all parties, under personal management. After a slow start, she was rather surprised to find that her services were in considerable demand. She was consulted about missing husbands, about the credit worthiness of potential business partners, and about suspected fraud by employees. In almost every case, she was able to come up with at least some information for the client. When she could not, she waived her fee, which meant that virtually nobody who consulted her was dissatisfied. People in Botswana liked to talk, she discovered, and the mere mention of the fact that she was a private detective would let loose a positive outpouring of information on all sorts of subjects. It flattered people, she concluded, to be approached by a private detective, and this effectively loosened their tongues. Difficult vocabulary. The assets are the valuables, and in our case, it's the properties that Ma had. Intuition means instinct. Abundance means plenty of. There is plenty of this. Inventory, the list of properties, in which you cannot include her courage or readiness to listen. The inventory is the list of physical properties like desk and the mugs of coffee she had. To shimmer is to glow. Stature are the respected people or the respected status of people. Trials usually mean lawsuits, but in our case, in our context, it means distress, discomfort. Script means economized, made little. To waive is to renounce, to give up. When she was unable to solve a case, she would renounce her wage or her fee. This means she would say, I'm not gonna take money. This is for free. To flatter, to praise. A patriot, which could be a noun to describe a person, or a description. We say a patriot person. Or we could just say a patriot, which means someone who is very loyal to his country. Idle means inactive. Don't confuse it with ideal, which is I-D-E-A-L spelled, and it means perfect. Pressing matters means crucial matters. Contemplate means to think deeply. The proceeds means the profits. Racked means tormented, put through suffering. And to dither or dithered means hesitated. The double negatives or the double negative structures used in the text. First of all, what is double negative? There are two negative words used in the same sentence. Using two negatives usually turns the thought or the sentence into a positive one. As the cartoon suggests, when the defendant says, I didn't do nothing, there are two negatives here. The did not, the not next to the verb, and the word nothing that indicates nothing has happened. So I didn't do nothing turns to I did something. That's why the jury, the thought bubble above the jury is a confession. Examples of this is I didn't steal nothing. This is a common informal way of negative, and it is unfortunately incorrect. I didn't steal nothing means I stole something. I can't find my keys nowhere. It means I can find my keys everywhere, so they are right in front of me. You cannot see no one in this crowd. It means you can see everyone or anyone, right? Double negative usually are discouraged in English because they are considered to be poor grammar. It is of ill grammar to say double negatives, and they can be confusing. However, they are sometimes used in everyday casual, informal speech. Virtually nobody who consulted her was dissatisfied. This is the statement that was about Ma Ramotsue, that nobody who consulted her was dissatisfied. This means everybody who consulted her was satisfied, right? The double negative makes the effort positive. Proper inverted commas. There are some inverted commas that are missing from the text. I hope you realized it while we were reading. And those are in paragraph 4, there was supposed to be, this is a direct speech. I am not ashamed to be called an African patriot, said Ma Ramotsue. I love all the people whom God made, but I especially know how to love the people who live in this place. They are my people, my brothers and sisters. It is my duty to help them to solve the mysteries in their lives. That is what I am called to do. Whenever the I finished, that indicates to you that this is a direct speech. Whenever the I finish and the my and the me, anything in the first person singular, this means the direct speech is over and you can close the inverted comma. Paragraph 6 and 7, again, everything, thought Ma Ramotswe, has been something before. Here I am, the only lady private detective in the whole of Botswana, sitting in my front detective agency, as we said, or in front of my detective agency. There's a my first person singular. Carry on the quotation marks. But only a few years ago, there was no detective agency. And before that, before there were even any buildings here, there were just the acacia trees and the riverbed in the distance and the Kalahari over there, so close. Here, the paragraph ends, but the quotation, the way she is speaking, did not end yet, because in the following paragraphs, in those days, the word "those days" refer to the previous one, to the previous paragraph. If she had said "in these days," it means that's something to follow, something that's coming in this paragraph. But if I say something and then I tell you those were my actions, this demonstrative adjective refers to something back. That's why the word "those" here refers to the previous paragraph, and she means the days that there were only the acacia trees. That's why we continue the quotation marks here. So in those days, there was no Botswana even, just the Bechuana land proctorate. And before that again, there was Khama's country and lions with the dry wind in their manes. But look at it now, a detective agency right here in Gaborone with me, the fat lady detective, sitting outside and thinking these thoughts about how what is one thing today becomes quite another thing tomorrow, or quite another thing tomorrow, sorry. I want you to take note of something here. Fat lady. How can we use it as euphemism? How can we belittle the effect of saying fat lady? Think about that. The use of monologue and dialogue. The use of monologue, just like with Anne Frank, or the Diary of Anne Frank, and the use of dialogue, which she as well did it, Anne Frank, and here in this case it's between Ma and her father. Why do we use that? What's the effect of monologue and dialogue? Monologues add reflection and self-assessment, that she is or she got out of her body and she's talking to a different version of herself. The dialogue adds authenticity, credibility to the story. She didn't say, "My father said that I should open a butchery." She said, "My father said, go and open a butchery, my daughter. Be a butcher." This adds authenticity. In this case, and place of the dialogue, that is the hospital, it serves as indicator of intimate relationship between the father and the daughter. She's talking to him, holding his hand while he's dying. This conveys close relationship between the two. Capitalizing the sign. Why was that capitalized? This is to convey how it was written outside and how proud she was of it. If you remember, we said last week that we capitalize words in order to, in informal speech or in informal settings like this one, in order to convey that we are shouting them, that they are of great emotions to us. Well, this is one of them. It is of great emotions to her that she's very proud of it, but she's definitely not shouting her name while someone is walking out. Like, she's not standing at the door and just shouting number one detective, lady detective agency. That's inconceivable. So it's basically just to convey how she has written it outside, how has she painted it outside, and how proud she is of it. Plural possessives, you know that when we have a plural that ends in an S, you need to add possessive to it, you just add the apostrophe. But if the plural, no need for the S, the other S, but if the plural does not end in S, like people or cattle, which is uncountable, this means that you can add an S. So detectives, the plural already ends in an S. The possessive plural would not be detectives, S apostrophe S, no. Agency is the same. Secretary is the same. But people is plural and it does not end in S. That's why for possessive, we can add an apostrophe and an S. The same for cattle. If we want to describe Ma Ramotswe in our own words from this whole text that we have read, how can we describe her physically, for inner description and outer description, psychological and physical? Ma Ramotswe is an only child who respected and loved her father. This is the summarizing skill or the paraphrasing skill to be more clear. She appreciates the beauty of her environment and enjoys the company, being sociable and religious. The job of a detective and helping others she considers to be her calling. She's clever, intuitive, and observant. She's not afraid to be original and has high standards, but she does not stand on dignity. She never used of herself. The formal title she could have insisted on, so she never takes advantage of her position. She finds time to reflect on the past and on change. The style of her speech or thought is generous with words and sensitive in details. For example, she says the lions with the dry wind in their manes. Very sensible. Has to do with the five senses. Her reputation is more important to her than money. And her ability to emphasize with others or to empathize with others makes her not charge them if they are disappointed. This is how good she is. Your wording does not have to be the same, of course. As long as you mention most of her attributes, you are good to go. Caped do-gooder takes Zek, law enforcement, into his own hands. We have a Zek Superman. He may not look much of a superhero in his blue tights, but a masked Zek vigilante who fights antisocial behavior has found fame after posting videos of his stunts on YouTube. The self-styled savior goes by the name of Super Vaclav and hides his real identity in a mock Superman costume, complete with a blue cape, a mask, a white ski helmet, and black jump boots. Somewhat overweight and pushing 40, Super Vaclav has become the scourge of Prague's drug dealers, dog foulers, and inconsiderate drivers. Indeed, he targets almost anyone who he regards as nuisance, including illicit smokers, graffiti artists, and residents who refuse to recycle their rubbish. Videos of his feats, including one showing him using a forklift truck to lift a Mini that has been wrongly parked in a disabled parking bay. He left the car suspended 2 meters above the ground until the bemused owner came back to claim it. Other footage shows Super Vaclav following people who have dropped litter to make them return and put it in the bin. There's also a film of him blocking the traffic on one of Prague's busiest roads with a large banner urging motorists to protect the environment by walking or cycling to work instead. Super Vaclav said his deeds were intended to inspire his fellow citizens to civic action. I think something is foul in this country, and I'm frustrated because nobody will do anything about it. We're all passive and seem indifferent, be it all politics or anything else, he said. I had no choice but to put on a costume. I believe our country needs a superhero. Difficult vocabulary or expressions. He wears tights. This means tight fitting trousers. The word tights refers to tight fitting trousers. Vigilante is a citizen who undertake law enforcement in their community without legal authority, like Batman, for example, or the character of Batman. They or he enforces law by his own hands in his community without any legal authority. He's not appointed by the government or the city. Stunts. They are actions displaying spectacular skill and daring. Scourge, misfortune. Fowlers are the wicked. Nuisance is the noun of or the noun for inconvenience. Illicit means prohibited by law. The feats are the accomplishments. Bemused driver is the confused driver. Deeds are the actions. And passive, it means inactive. So passive citizens, they are inactive. They don't do anything to try to fix their society. Self-styled savior, this is someone who has appointed himself as a rescuer. Nobody appointed him or her. He goes by the name of, it means he's generally known, or AKA, as known as. He's pushing 40, it means that he's closing to the age of 40. The civic action, it means public service. Be it about politics or anything else, whether it concerns politics or anything else. We're done for today. Thank you very much for listening. Stay safe and keep up the good work.